Hi guys, as promised, here is my face for this very, very small lecture, and here is my parents' dog. This is Millie. So I'm going to let her go now because she's very heavy. You go, good girl. Okay. So in this lecture, we are going to be looking at the psychological components of the biopsychosocial risk factors and how they interact and combine to help in the causation and the progression of mental illness. So just remembering that psychological factors are factors that originate from within the mind. So we've got things like your cognition, so your memories, your attention, your concentration. We've got things like personality traits and things like coping skills, as well as emotions. Now we would consider those internal, and it's pretty hard to kind of change those things, and you can generally do so through things like therapy, but they're not super easy to change, like environmental factors. So to help you to remember the factors that are psychological, we have an acronym RISE. So we have R for rumination, we have I for impaired reasoning and memory, we have S for stress, and we have E for self-efficacy. So our first psychological risk factor is rumination. So rumination is repeated thinking or dwelling on undesirable thoughts and feelings without acting to change them. So for example, someone with depression might focus more on the negative aspects of an event or their life rather than trying to think of ways to help alleviate their feelings of sadness or stress about a situation. Rumination is really similar to worry. However, it is different in so much as worry talks about negative feelings, I suppose, related to things in the future. So, for example, if you had negative feelings about a sack that was coming up next week, that would be more likely to be worry. Rumination is focused on things that have happened in the past. So, for example, if you were still upset about the SAC score that you did at the beginning or the SAC that you did at the beginning of the year, and you kept thinking about it over and over and over and over and over, then that's more likely to be rumination. So, rumination prevents problem solving, and that in turn increases feelings of hopelessness. So, what rumination actually does is it prolongs or impedes, I should say, problem solving strategies that may minimize or address some kind of concern or stressor that you're having. So, because you're ruminating so much, you can't see a way of overcoming or minimizing the stressor, and you will never develop a solution to fix the stressor. So, in that sense, that's when rumination heightens the risk of a mental disorder. When people constantly ruminate, they start to view the world and their future in a more negative and pessimistic way. So what actually is happening is it actually inhibits mood changing and improving strategies such as distraction, and it also acts as a perpetuating symptom. Excuse me, I just ate my dinner. A perpetuating symptom of mental illness. So when they ruminate in the context of having a low mood, people tend to recall more negative memories from the past. They interpret their current situation more negatively, are more pessimistic, and are hopeless about their future. So what this can actually, I guess, lead to is it can cause either a low mood to devolve into depression, or it can actually continue those depressive symptoms in kind of like a never-ending like feedback. So that's why we say this is a risk factor in the development and the perpetuation of mental illnesses, particularly depression. So our second psychological risk factor is poor self-efficacy. So self-efficacy refers to a person's belief that they will be able to persist and succeed in accomplishing a goal. Self-efficacy is a little bit different to self-esteem, which means or is our overall feelings of self-worth. Self-efficacy is a little bit more situation or context specific. So for example, we might have some really high self-efficacy for one kind of task that we engage in and low self-efficacy for other kinds of tasks. So if you have a strong self-efficacy, it means you're more likely to approach a difficult task as a challenge, and you're also more likely to have more motivation to do the task and persist in the face of obstacles. Self-efficacy is typically learned through experience, so the more we experience success on a task, the more likely we are to feel confident and perform well on a similar task or the same task in future. So what self-efficacy actually does is helps, or good self-efficacy that is it helps to interpret potentially threatening situations as things that are more manageable, and that will help us eventually or in the long run to reduce our sense of stress or our levels of stress surrounding the task. Low self-efficacy, on the other hand, is the reduced belief in one's capacity to execute behaviours necessary to succeed in specific situations or accomplish a specific task. So if we believe a stressful event is far worse than it really is, and having no self-confidence that we can overcome it will lead to stress. Now that low level of confidence in our ability to overcome or cope with a stressor, that is low efficacy. So what this actually does is it helps people, or it prevents people, I should say, prevents people from effectively dealing with stressful situations because they feel like they can't actually deal with it. So people with low self-efficacy tend to have a couple of characteristics. They tend to shy away from difficult tasks because they see them as personal threats. They have low aspirations. When faced with difficult tasks, they are likely to dwell on their personal deficiencies, any kinds of obstacles they might encounter, and all kinds of adverse outcomes. They tend to give up easily. They avoid difficult tasks. They worry more and blame themselves when setbacks occur. And overall, this results in feelings of hopelessness and higher levels of stress. So this increases feelings of hopelessness and lack of control. So what this actually means, if we're linking it back to mental illness, is that this will affect how vulnerable a person is to experiencing stress and anxiety when they're dealing with situations that they feel like they have control or no control over. And so if you have low self-efficacy, that increased level of hopelessness and stress means that you're more likely to develop a mental illness in future. And our third psychological risk factor is stress. So what is stress? So stress is a state of physical or mental tension when the demands of a situation or event exceed the perceived ability of an individual to cope. Now, in area of study 1 in unit 3, we looked a lot of stress. We looked a lot about stress, and we looked at the biological aspects of stress, like the fight-flight response. We looked at the role of cortisol in the body. We looked at the gas model, and we also looked at Lazarus and Folkman. So you can kind of bring in those areas when we're looking at stress in relation to mental illness. We know that we have two types of stress: eustress and distress. And distress is a negative psychological response to stress, and it impedes our ability to cope with stresses at an optimal level. So we know that if we are really, really stressed, we're more likely to be around here if we're feeling distressed. So we have lower levels of coping ability than if we had eustress, which is up here. So we know that when you're stressed, the prolonged release of stress hormones interferes with our mood regulation and our cognitive processes. So what that actually means is that we have an increased vulnerability to the development of a mental disorder. So this often depends on how we appraise the stressor and how we appraise our coping skills. So if we think that the situation is stressful, but we have coping skills, we're going to feel much less stress and therefore be much less likely to develop a mental illness over time than if we perceive a situation to be stressful and perceive our own coping ability to be much, much less. So, for example, an ambitious senior school student with poor coping skills and lacking in resilience and social support might be subjected to a heightened workload and pressure to get really good scores on exams over a prolonged period of time. Now, if that's the case and they're having those high levels of stress and they feel like they can't cope with those stresses, what this means is they're much more likely to get a mental illness over a longer period of time than somebody who, for example, does have good coping skills and does have social support. So what we know is that chronic stress can lead to much more serious long-term psychological and physiological problems, more specifically mental illnesses. And our last psychological risk factor is impaired reasoning and memory. So, in order to be mentally healthy, we must have strong cognitive skills. So, we must have a good memory ability, we must have logical thinking, planning, and concentration. What research studies have found is that about 80% of people with schizophrenia, more specifically, experience cognitive problems. That's also really similar to people who have other kinds of mental disorders who might not have such an extent of cognitive problems, but do have problems with memories, reasoning, and attention. What's really interesting about this research is that this explains why some people with schizophrenia or other kinds of mental illnesses might jump to certain conclusions or they might make assumptions about their world. So I'm talking more specifically about things that are maybe not realistic. So things like hallucinations and delusions. So reasoning is goal-directed thinking in judgments, and they are made from known or assumed facts. Impaired reasoning leads to impaired memories. So if we think that someone is following us despite evidence that suggests otherwise, then we would consolidate this as a memory. So what we can see here is that one thing leads to the other. So reasoning kind of leads to incorrect memories. And we know a lot about incorrect memories from our work on Loftus. So what the key thing here is, I suppose, is reasoning. So when we are engaged in good reasoning, we use what we already know or what we assume to be true and draw conclusions that we believe to be correct. Having good reasoning skills allows us to solve problems and it allows us to deal with the challenges that we meet in everyday life. If we have flawed thinking that impedes our goal-directed behavior or maybe doesn't allow us to rationally consider probabilities that decide if that an outcome is likely to be true or not, that can lead to problems with memories, as I've said. So impaired reasoning can also contribute to the onset of a condition, more specifically conditions like schizophrenia. So we're more likely to believe in delusional thoughts, even though they're probably not true. So for example, someone might believe, regardless of what they are told or shown, that, I don't know, scientists are trying to poison them with, I don't know, satellites from the air. And so what that actually means is they're much more likely to jump to conclusions based on impaired reasoning, and that can have a really negative effect on mental illness or mental health, I should say. Now, I've already spoken about how impaired reasoning can affect memory, but we also know that if we have impaired memories, this kind of leads to another bit of a feedback loop, in so much as we need to retrieve information from long-term memories when we're making judgments. So if you're consolidating memories that are based on faulty information or faulty reasoning, and then you're later retrieving them and relying on that information and assuming it's true, then what you're actually perceiving and judging might be completely false. This is very true when it comes to people with mental illnesses because studies have shown that episodic memories tend to show the greatest loss in people with mental disorders. So in this little diagram here, we can see that in these, I guess, disorders down the side, we can see what kinds of memory deficiencies that these particular disorders are associated with. So if we're looking at things like episodic memories and a decline, so we see that there's less episodic memory in major depressive disorders, in schizophrenia, in autism, in bipolar, and PTSD. We can also see that in a lot of these disorders, particularly depression, schizophrenia, bipolar again, and OCD, there are also problems with short-term working memory. So all of these can lead to that faulty reasoning and again, can just go around in a loop. And what's happening is we are consolidating incorrect information and then retrieving it again to work with that information. So it's all bad pretty much. Okay, so that is the end of the psychological risk factors, and I will film the social risk factors for you shortly. So I hope you've enjoyed my face. please subscribe to my channel and I will see you next time.